Good evening. Welcome to the Los Angeles World Affairs Council and Town Hall. I'm Kim McCleary, President and CEO, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to this evening's program. Thank you all for your ongoing support, and we hope you will stay tuned to the end of today's program for a brief summary on our upcoming programs. If you're not yet a member, please consider joining. There's so many great benefits, and we're going to be bringing back our in-person events soon. So please go to our website at lawacth.org and sign up today. For those of you who would like to ask Dan questions, there's a control panel on the right-hand side of the screen where you can type in your questions. Jessica DeGanzik, our Vice President of Events, will be managing your questions during the Q&A portion of today's program, which is starting about 30 or 35 minutes. It's now my pleasure to bring on our own professor, Dan Schnur, Professor Berkeley, UCLA, and USC. Hey, Dan.
Hey, Kim, how are you?
Boy, such busy news headlines. They must keep you so busy preparing for these programs.
Well, there's no question there's a lot going on, and so I'm looking forward to today's topics.
We are too. Let me get to those two topics really quickly and turn it over to you, Dan. Topic one, what the California oil spill and China's energy crisis mean for climate change. And second, inflation, goods shortages, and shipping backlogs, how COVID could ruin the holidays again. Oy vey. Okay, take it over, Dan.
Oy vey, that's a new Kim-ism, so we'll use that to get started. But Kim, thank you very much as always, and thanks to all of you as always for joining us for these conversations. As Kim mentioned, the first thing we're going to talk about today is climate change, and I know it's an issue we discussed on the webinar not too long ago, just a few weeks back, but a couple of items in the news that have made it, I thought, increasingly relevant and newsworthy to look at the broader topic from a slightly different perspective than we have in the past. Now, as Kim mentioned, the oil spill off the coast of Orange County has been dominating news headlines, not just here in California, but nationally for the last couple of weeks. And along with those headlines, we've seen, not surprisingly, we've seen a renewed effort to ban offshore oil drilling off of the California coast and a broader push for stronger environmental protection measures across the board. Now, this isn't anything new. Just about every major environmental disaster inevitably leads to louder calls for federal and state government to do more to protect our national resources. And we'll talk about some of the historical precedents for that in just a second. But before we do, Claire, let's go to our first question for our group here. And let's ask everyone, what do you think? Should offshore oil drilling be banned? And we have three options for you here today on this question anyway. Yes, the offshore drilling should be banned immediately. A second, it should be banned, but we should do it gradually because we need to make time to gradually allow for a transition. There's a lot of workers whose livelihoods depend on this industry. And so by doing it a bit more slowly, perhaps we can help them transition into other types of work. And third and finally, no, we shouldn't ban it. We should not ban drilling, at least not until solar and wind power and other types of alternative energy are able to handle all of our energy demands, not just some of them. So let's see what we got for our group here, Claire. What did they have to say? Well, very interesting. I know we've got a very strong environmental group, but it's instructive that 59%, more than half of you, said that yes, while offshore drilling should be banned, it does need to be done more slowly, given those economic considerations and perhaps others. 22%, a little bit less than a quarter, said we should ban right now, yes, immediately. And 20% said no, not until we've gotten a lot further along with our alternative energy source development. But as I said just a moment ago, over the years, for decades now, whenever there's a real environmental disaster somewhere in the country, somewhere in the world, the calls for more stringent environmental regulation, not surprisingly, get much louder. And that's been the case ever since the mammoth Santa Barbara oil spill back in 1969, which effectively gave birth to the modern environmental movement. And we've seen it since then over the years, after smaller spills in San Francisco and in Huntington Beach, and at the national level, after much larger catastrophes like the Exxon Valdez spill in Alaska back in the 1980s, and the Deepwater disaster in the Gulf of Mexico back in 2010. Let's put this Orange County spill into some historical context. It appears that the spill off of Huntington Beach that we've been following in the news over the last couple of weeks, it appears that spill seems to have caused about 126,000 gallons of crude oil to leak into the ocean. By comparison, the Santa Barbara spill back in the 1960s was about 4 million gallons. That's the largest environmental disaster in California history. The Exxon Valdez crash up in Alaska involved 11 million gallons of crude oil. And the Gulf spill back in 2010, the Deepwater disaster, that was responsible for more than 130 million gallons of crude oil spilling into the Gulf of Mexico. But even though this current Orange County catastrophe is much smaller in terms of direct impact, the debate's is still been extremely intense because it's taking place in the context of that broader discussion about how to mitigate climate change. So on one hand, this brings even more public attention to the accident. On the other, it creates some additional complications. And we'll get to those complications in just a couple of minutes. But first, I'd like to turn the conversation to a much greater environmental challenge. And that challenge is what Kim and I foreshadowed a couple of minutes ago. That challenge is China. Now, as we've talked about on this program previously, Joe Biden took office very focused on the idea that the United States could challenge China on economic issues, on trade issues, on human rights issues, on security matters. But what he wanted to do very badly, Biden was very strong and very emphatic that he wanted to keep the conversation on climate change walled off from those other difficult matters, because he felt that climate change was such a global challenge that we needed to move forward on that in partnership with China, even while perhaps being more confrontational on other fronts. Now, for a while, given the enormity of the climate change threat, that separation looked like it might be possible. It looked like Biden might be able to pull it off. But now tensions are growing, as you've all read. Tensions are growing between the two countries on Taiwan, on Hong Kong, on the fate of the Uyghurs up in northwestern China, and on a whole range of trade and tariff issues. And so that separation is starting to look a lot less likely. So one of the reasons that Biden called Chinese President Xi Jinping recently, and one of the primary motivators for what will be their first summit meeting later this year, is that China is now making it very clear that climate change is not a separate issue from the security and human rights and economic matters. But in fact, Chinese leaders are now saying that climate change needs to be discussed in the context of all those other points of disagreement between the two countries. And that, as you might suspect, is going to slow down the discussion considerably. Now, the most visible of those disagreements right now is Taiwan and the very aggressive actions that the Chinese military is taking in the waters surrounding Taiwan. That's a topic for another day's webinar. We'll need to come back to China and Taiwan and the US sometime in the next few weeks, when we can devote a sufficient amount of time and depth to it. But there are plenty of other areas of conflict for the two countries to work out too. China is hoping that by pushing on climate change, that the US and other countries will not escalate their language on Hong Kong or on the Uyghurs, at least not before the Winter Olympics in Beijing next February, because a major human rights conflagration at that point could be an immense embarrassment for the Chinese government. China is also facing a growing economic crisis. And now that Biden has announced he intends to keep many of the Trump administration tariffs in place, Xi's hoping that if he plays hard to get on climate change, that might persuade Biden to eat up on trade restrictions. So the idea of addressing these issues on parallel tracks doesn't look likely in the near to medium range. So the question I have for all of you is this: should the US back off on our human rights and security concerns with China in order to make it more likely that they work with us and with the rest of the world on climate change? This one's a pretty simple one. We didn't give you a whole lot of nuance here, just yes or no. Should the US back off on human rights and security differences with China to move forward on climate change? Is it worth it, in other words, in order to make progress on these key environmental issues? Or alternatively, no. Climate change is important, but human rights, the security of Taiwan and other countries in the region are critical too. So as important as climate change is, we can't give up. What do all you think? What do we got here, Claire? Oh, wow. Look at that. That is a very emphatic answer from our group. 71%, more than 2/3, almost 3/4, believe that the United States should not back off on human rights and security concerns, even if it means slower progress on climate change. So very, very interesting. Now, most relevant though, even more than the other issues we've been talking about, most relevant to the climate change conversation is China's very severe and growing energy crisis. In recent weeks, there have been reports of widespread forced blackouts where huge industrial sites have been shut down, and millions of Chinese citizens have been left without power. In some cities in China now, if you live in an apartment building, you're not allowed to take the elevator to the second or third floor. Only if you live on one of the higher levels are you allowed to take the elevator in an effort to save energy. China is still very, very dependent on coal and other fossil fuels. And the current energy shortage is leading them to lean even more on these sources. And China is not alone on this. India and other Pacific Rim countries are facing very similar shortfalls, and India too is very, very reliant on the use of coal. And Europe's energy crunch appears to be even worse. Russia is already attempting to leverage the European energy crisis by speeding up implementation of their natural gas pipeline. There are huge lines for gasoline in Great Britain. And even here in the US, we might not have noticed it as much in California because our gas prices are so much higher than the rest of the country. But the national average price of gasoline here in the United States has almost doubled just in the last 90 days. So with energy prices going up like this, it creates two additional problems. First, the cost of energy is the single biggest driver of inflation, and we'll talk more about that in our second segment. And that creates all sorts of other economic challenges. But it also puts additional strain on alternative energy sources like solar and wind and hydropower, which we're learning, quite frankly, simply aren't yet ready to take on the additional load. Well, let's go back to our group if we can, Claire, and let's ask everyone, how much more are you willing to pay for gasoline to aggressively fight climate change? We know that these measures are causing prices to go up in Europe and in the United States and elsewhere around the world. And once again, the question becomes, how important is this fight? And what is the sacrifice that we're willing to make for it? Are we willing to pay 50 cents more a gallon, $1, $2 more? Or is fighting climate change so important that we'll pay whatever it takes to fill our gas tanks? Or alternatively, on the opposite end of the spectrum, we say just no more, gas prices are already high enough, and we're going to stop right here. Let's see how our group did. Oh, wow, look at that. 38% of us, 38% of our group says gasoline prices can go up as much as necessary in order to fight against climate change. The second highest number, though, is 21% who don't want to see prices go up at all. And now maybe we see why President Biden is having a difficult time getting his package through Congress, given this wide range of opinions. On the more incremental increases, 13% say that they'd pay 50 cents a gallon, but no more. 20% say $1 more a gallon. 9% say $2 more a gallon. But if you add up that $2 more per gallon and whatever it takes, that's 47%, which means almost half of our group says that they're willing to pay a very significant additional amount of money in order to up our fight against climate change. Now, here's the complicating factor, though. Regardless of how much we pay, this challenge with alternative energies doesn't change. Because while solar and wind power have reached stages where they can be effectively used on a mass scale, hydropower is still evolving on that front, as are biofuels. But solar and wind power can be used on a mass scale. The problem is a lack of storage capacity. Solar batteries and wind storage simply can't handle enough energy for extended periods of time to get through times without much sun or wind. And that right now is the biggest obstacle to speeding the transition away from fossil fuels, even more than the cost of traditional forms of energy. Wind and solar power production have soared in the last decade. But both of those sources are pretty fickle. They're available at some times and not others. And it's a lot harder to store electricity than it is to store gas or coal. So both because of prices and availability, we're seeing countries all over the world during this energy crisis turning back more and more toward their traditional resources of fossil fuels because they simply don't see the options available in the short term, even as much as most countries and their people understand the importance of fostering that transition in the long term. So far, natural gas has been the stable backup that wind and solar need. And that works just fine, as long as gasoline prices aren't going through the roof. But of course they are. Now, why are all these shortfalls taking place? It's COVID. During the pandemic, during the shutdown, people used less energy. We drove less. Air travel was down dramatically. Many of us worked from home, and so less energy is used for commercial buildings and offices. And so the energy suppliers cut back. And now, even though COVID isn't gone, the world is reopening. And the energy suppliers, both traditional and alternative, just weren't ready for it. Now, that's a temporary problem, not a permanent one, but it's not going to be solved anytime soon. The good news is we're moving toward a carbon-free society. But it doesn't happen by magic, and it doesn't happen overnight. So the lesson here isn't to abandon the use of alternative fuels, of course, but rather to be more realistic in how quickly we can increase our dependence on them. Because while in the long run, a solar wind-based energy future for the country and the world are in everyone's best interest in the fight against climate change, that's not happening in the near future. And the higher our expectations become, the more we're going to run into these types of energy crises in the future. So let's move on to our second topic. And then in just a little while, when we get to the bottom of the hour, of course, we'll open it up to your questions, which is, I think I've told you many times before, is my favorite part of the program. But in the meantime, topic number 2, will COVID ruin the holidays again? Hanukkah, Christmas, Kwanzaa, we're all looking forward to holidays this December that we didn't get to celebrate last year. Last year, the coronavirus ruined the holidays for many of us because we weren't able to travel, and we weren't able to gather in large groups, even with family, with extended family. So now, this year, many people are planning to get together in person, which is wonderful. But COVID's getting in the way again. This time, because of the immense slowdowns in deliveries and the lack of availability of many products, including holiday presents and holiday decorations. And so the slowdown of the global supply chain has very, very broad economic potential impact, much more than just the holidays. And this is due to a combination of COVID outbreaks in key Asian supplier countries, but also because of a huge increase in consumer demand over the course of the pandemic when we were all forced to stay at home. And what happened when we were stuck at home? I don't know about you, but most people became much more reliant on ordering products for delivery online. Because we weren't traveling, because we weren't going to restaurants, because we weren't going to movie theaters or to sporting events, people were using their disposable income on things, on products, to make their homes more comfortable. And we became much, much more reliant on online retail in order to satisfy those consumer cravings. But not only because of the COVID outbreaks in the countries that are supplying these products, but we're also seeing very severe shortages of domestic workers. There's a lack of truckers, a lack of warehouse workers here in the United States. Job openings have hit record highs throughout the sector. And so companies are struggling to fill these roles and to keep factories and other businesses operating at full capacity when the Delta infections come through. Now, at the same time as all of this, the COVID outbreaks in Asia, the increased consumer demand, the worker shortages, the other thing going on here is a much longer term trend that came long before the pandemic. So for many years now, we've been seeing a gradual but ultimately very dramatic shrinkage in US manufacturing capacity. And that forces domestic retailers to rely much more heavily on foreign imports at the worst possible time for all the reasons I've been talking about. So the best solution to shipping delays from other parts of the world would be to make more things here, right? So why don't we? Why don't we make more things here and not have to worry about all those shipping costs? And the answer, because we don't want to. Or at least, what, can we hold off for just 1 second on that, Claire? Okay. That was a rhetorical question, not a question for the group, and that's totally my fault. So why don't we make more things here? And the answer, as I was saying, is because we don't want to. At least we haven't wanted to for a long time. Because for decades, US companies have been moving their manufacturing overseas. And they've been taking advantage of cheaper labor and cheaper materials in other countries. But the pandemic and the supply chain breakdowns are a reminder that the decline of manufacturing is going to be felt much more deeply during a crisis like this one. And that's why Biden's infrastructure proposal includes so much money to increase domestic manufacturing and to beef up domestic supply chains, and why that aspect of his proposal, at least, has so much bipartisan support in Congress. So make no mistake, the global supply chain is so broken that only the biggest stores are going to be able to obtain and store sufficient inventory. And no one can predict how long that situation is going to last. But it's not going to be solved by December. So in short, supply chains depend on containers, ports, railroads, warehouses, and trucks. And every stage of this international assembly line is breaking down in a slightly different way. So now, Claire, if we can go up with the question, given all those options, what do you think is the most important cause for all these shipping slowdowns and inflation? Is it the COVID delays at the Asian ports? Is it the shortage of truckers and workers in the United States? Is it a lack of US manufacturing capacity? Is it heightened consumer demand for products, or is it something else? Now, the correct answer is, of course, all of the above, but we're asking you to pick out one that you think is even more important and even more impactful than the rest. So Claire, let's see what our group has to tell us on this one, can we? Oh, 42% point to this as a shortage of workers, of truckers and warehouse workers in the United States. And another 29% talk about the lack of emphasize the lack of US manufacturing capacity. What that means is 71%, almost 3/4 of our group, sees the primary challenges as domestic, not international. Only 10% believe that it's because of the delays at Asian ports. My own opinion is it's probably somewhat more than that. And 13% is our own demand for products that we, until very recently, would have had to go to stores to buy. Thanks, of course, to online commerce, we're able to do on our own. So let's agree that all of those are contributing factors. So what does this mean? What does this add up to? It means this holiday season, we're going to be seeing a lot more of those brawls among shoppers in brick and mortar stores who couldn't buy their presents or decorations online. It means fewer deals for Black Friday because the retailers don't have to give us any price cuts. But what it probably means is online price wars that are going to end up threatening the livelihood of those brick and mortar retailers. Now, right now, there are hundreds of cargo ships waiting off of key ports around the country, like Long Beach and Los Angeles here in California, waiting to be unloaded. And so a lot of the big box retailers are taking matters into their own hands. Walmart, Home Depot, Lululemon, they're all chartering their own boats instead of relying on traditional supply chains. That's how much are willing to invest in order to have at least some products in their stores or delivered on time, rather than risking angry customers over the long run. But that's not going to be enough. So my very non-expert advice to all of you is you should start and finish your holiday shopping as soon as you can, because if we wait much longer, we're not going to see those presents and those decorations in time for the holidays. But again, as I said earlier, this is much bigger than just the holidays, because the shipping slowdown and the scarcity of these products has also become a very, very significant contributor to continued high levels of inflation. And just like the discussion we were having earlier about the high demand and limited supply of gasoline, the same consumer dynamics hold with these products too. And what that means is that products keep getting more expensive, prices keep getting higher, and they're staying high much longer than most experts expect. So I'll give you one example of how inflation is impacted by international shipping. Shipping a package from Shanghai to Los Angeles is currently 6 times more expensive than shipping the same package from LA to Shanghai. So the nature of our consumer demands are driving those prices further and further upward. How much is that? Well, before the pandemic, reserving a shipping container, one shipping container that holds 35,000 books, costs $2,500. So $2,500 for one of those big shipping containers you see on the news and on video. Before the pandemic, those shipping containers cost $2,500 each. Now those same containers cost $25,000 each, 10 times what they cost before the pandemic. And because of the trade imbalance between the US and the Pacific Rim, we're paying much, much more for those products than residents of those countries are for anything that we ship over there. Now, we haven't had sustained inflation in the United States for decades, but inflation slows the economy, and it has a particularly difficult impact on low-income workers and families because these rising costs take proportionally more out of their paychecks. And that, in turn, leads to a longer conversation about the United States and the global economy. But that one's going to have to wait for another day, because we're just about at the bottom of the hour, and it's time for Jessica and for all of you to weigh in with your questions. So, Jessica, there you are.
Okay.
How are we doing in terms of questions?
Got a lot coming in, so I don't think we'll get through all of them before 6 o'clock, but
do our best.
Yeah. Before we launch into the Q&A session, I just want to thank our viewers and members and supporters for all of your help and donations. Of course, we are not able to do in-person events quite yet, So anything you can contribute either as a member or as a donation to help us continue these complimentary live stream discussions, we greatly appreciate. You can visit our website at lawacth.org and either become a member or make a donation. We greatly appreciate it. All right, on to these questions. Between China and the USA, which country feels the global supply chain bottlenecks more and why?
Okay. So as we were talking about just before we got to the bottom of the hour, the US is feeling this impact to a much greater degree because we import so many more goods from China than not just China, but the other Pacific Rim countries import from the US, largely because of our diminished domestic manufacturing supply and because of our heightened consumer appetites. That means, as I was saying earlier, that we're paying much, much more, 6 times more, for the same container to be shipped from China to the US than we are for that container to be shipped from the US to China. China has no shortage of other problems. This energy crisis has the potential to be debilitating. They've had massive blackouts across the country and will for some time. Their economy is getting more and more precarious for any number of reasons, which we'll talk about in a future webinar. But on the specific question of the supply chain, we're being hurt much more than they are. Because their factories are getting paid. We're just not getting our products, at least not anywhere near as quickly.
China's electricity crunch has alarmed authorities and panicked businesses. Although coal-fired power still accounts for about 70% of China's electricity, there has been a lack of investment in the fuel. Why is that happening?
Okay. Well, I want to make sure, I'm not sure that I understand the question, but what I will say is that while China is still, as the questioner correctly noted, heavily dependent on coal and on other fossil fuels, it has been making an effort in recent years to begin, and I should emphasize begin, to shift its emphasis. And it now appears that because of the severity of the energy crisis they're facing, solar and wind and other alternative energies simply can't help them through that to the degree they need. So therefore, they're relying even more heavily on coal and on other more traditional fuel sources to get them through. It doesn't mean that they've abandoned their commitment to wind and solar and other green technologies, but for all practical purposes, it's mean that move has been delayed, not only just has been delayed, and given the tremendous amount of energy needs that China has to feed even its somewhat weakened economy, it's going to be a while before they renew that commitment to alternative energies. So on one hand, either because of reasons of their own commitment or because of the message they'd like to send to the rest of the world or both, China had been increasing its commitment toward green technology. But while that's not completely on hold right now, it's moving a lot more slowly than it was before these twin crises hit.
Unless China and India get on board now, climate change is on its way. Do you agree?
Well, I mean, climate change is on its way regardless. And we can, at this point, I believe, slow it, but not stop it. But I'll take the question, the premise of the question, which is if the world's largest energy consumers commit to alternative energies, we're a lot more likely to slow climate change than with the return to reliance on fossil fuels. And the challenge, whether it's in Pacific Rim countries like China or India, or whether it's in Europe or in the United States, telling fuel consumers, citizens, people, that they either have to pay a great deal more for energy or they have to go without because of these long-term commitments is a hard sell. You may remember in France not too long ago, they suffered through the so-called yellow vest protests when Macron at that point attempted to raise the energy tax, not during a time of crisis, but in order to raise revenues for other spending priorities that he had. And there was a huge revolt. You've seen similar types of anger erupting in Great Britain and then in other countries in mainland Europe. And so elected officials are going to be very reticent, particularly during a crisis like this one, to tell their voters to suffer through in the short run in order to make progress for the long run, even if intellectually they know that there's a benefit in doing so. It does become a harder sell during times of duress. And so rather than raising energy prices even higher, rather than expanding potential blackouts even more broadly, the most immediately amenable option is to use alternative energies for a smaller percentage of a country's overall fuel needs and to tap more heavily into coal and gas and oil reserves. And that's what we're seeing in every part of the world right now.
We know how climate change affects the US West and South. How will climate change affect China if we can't turn it around?
Well, it will affect the entire globe. I have to admit, I don't know, and because China, of course, is such a vast expanse, it has some subtropical areas and some subarctic areas. So I have to admit, I'm not smart enough or well-read enough to calibrate the environmental and economic damage that China will feel as climate change worsens versus other countries on the Pacific Rim or in the West or elsewhere. But I think rather than thinking of it in terms of comparison, I think the Chinese leadership understands the types of long-term impacts of climate change on their country, whether it's less or more than India or the US or Germany or Italy or Brazil or any other country in the world, is not as relevant in terms of the hierarchy, but rather acknowledging the long-term environmental and economic damage is going to be considerable in its own right, regardless of where it ranks on the world stage.
How about nuclear for base load power? It does not cause climate change.
Nuclear is a tricky conversation. It doesn't cause climate change, but public opinion, not only in the US, but around the world, even quite some time after 3 Mile Island and after the Chernobyl disaster, public opinion is still very wary of nuclear power. Now, many of the Western European countries rely on nuclear energy to a much greater degree than the United States does. But an increasing number of smart people in both parties are acknowledging that if the United States is going to move away from fossil fuels, because it's going to take such a long time to get to a point where solar and wind power can sustain an economy on its own, that moving away from those fossil fuels is going to require a greater reliance on nuclear energy than this country's been willing to tolerate in a long time. Convincing the voters of that is going to be a pretty good sized challenge.
What are state and federal government agencies, such as the Department of Transportation, doing about shortage of truckers?
Okay. Well, it's really more of a private sector pressure point. And what trucking companies are realizing is that during a time of economic shutdown in which, well, a couple of things are going on. Number one, of course, the federal government until recently provided many, many Americans with stipends to help them through the shutdown period. And although there's an ongoing debate about how much that contributed to the increase in unemployment and the increase of people who aren't looking for work, it was certainly a contributing factor. So someone who is receiving a check from Washington or from the state capitol might simply be less incentivized to spend days and days in a row on the road in the way that they might have before the pandemic. But second, there's such a competition for workers in other portions of the economy. The service industry in particular, restaurants, hotels, are fighting for workers in a way that they haven't had to in a long, long time. And once again, someone who may have made their living by driving a truck over long distances in the past may simply decide that the availability and increased pay and benefits of a job closer to home that allows that person to stay with their family rather than living on the road for days or weeks at a time has become more enticing. So the government can certainly help incentivize increased job opportunity in the sector. But at least at this point, the companies themselves are trying to figure out a way to create greater incentives to convince those former truckers to return to their old jobs, even though there's other opportunities closer to home available to them.
For supply chain, shouldn't we get National Guard to help unclog the ports, store goods on bases, for example?
Again, Jessica, you cut out for just 1 second.
Oh, I'm sorry about that. This questioner is saying, for supply chain, shouldn't we get National Guard to help unclog the ports or to possibly store goods on bases?
I don't know that there's much that the National Guard can do to help with the ports, because to a large degree, the challenge isn't staffing, at least not at the ports. It's simply capacity. There are so many ships waiting offshore. They're not able to land. Where those additional people, where those additional workers are needed, is not only in trucking but in warehouses. And so sending the National Guard to work in warehouses, unloading goods off trucks, would probably be a difficult feat to pull off. I don't know what the precisely delineated responsibilities can be for a National Guardsman or guardsperson, but I have to imagine that most governors would be reluctant to deploy them in that kind of storage and warehouse related capacity. Storing the products on military bases doesn't do a whole lot of good either, because it simply adds one more stop to the transportation chain. Excuse me. In other words, your product isn't getting to you any sooner. It's just sitting on a military base instead of in a warehouse or on a ship off port. So this is probably that while it causes, and more broadly, while this is the type of crisis that causes economic discomfort, historically it hasn't been the kind of crisis / disaster / emergency that governors have used to turn to the National Guard. I think this is one we're going to probably have to get through without military assistance.
How do you feel about changing our products to come from South America and Mexico instead of the Pacific Rim?
Well, the dynamic is still the same. As long as we're relying on other countries to produce our goods because of lower labor costs, less stringent environmental regulations, and other factors, we're still going to hit essentially the same. We're still going to hit essentially the same type of problem. The shipping distances might not be as great, but the dynamic is still the same, and the lack of capacity is just as great. So instead of having ships circling offshore, off of Long Beach and Los Angeles, we'd simply have trucks sitting at the US-Mexico border. Either way, the capacity doesn't exist to move those products into this country at the speed with which we become accustomed. And so I think each of these questions are interesting because they're looking for a fix to a supply and demand problem. And I don't know that you can fix a supply and demand problem with these types of alternatives. Ultimately, we have more people who want more things than we can deliver to them in a expected time period. And once again, the private sector interests themselves. The factories, the shippers, the stores are going to need to increase capacity, which they're trying to do. It's just going to take some time for them to ramp up in the aftermath of a pandemic that obviously they weren't expecting to begin with.
What goods can be easily manufactured in the United States?
What goods can be easily manufactured in the United States? If you listen to people who want to increase manufacturing capacity here, they will tell you the answer is almost anything and almost everything. The question isn't one of availability, it's a question of cost. It costs a lot more to manufacture products in this country than in other countries because of labor expenses, because of environmental restrictions or environmental protections, and for other reasons. And as long as we're going to pay our workers more here than other countries might, as long as we're going to impose these types of environmental protections, it's going to cost more to ship here or to build here, and that can be done. But of course, what that means is higher prices. Jessica, we asked our group a little bit earlier how much more they'd be willing to pay for gasoline in order to fight climate change more aggressively. We could ask the same question on a much broader and wider scale. How much more are you willing to pay for everything you buy? For food, for furniture, for cars, for everything, in order to increase American domestic manufacturing capacity. Now, this is something that Biden talks about quite a bit, and frankly, he downplays to some degree the increased cost of domestic manufactured products for American consumers. Because he's talking about creating American jobs, logically, he talks about re-enhancing American domestic manufacturing capacity. But the reason those products, those factories and those products and those workers ultimately moved overseas is so because they could be done less expensively and keep prices down in this country. If in addition to the other inflationary causes that we were talking about earlier, we add this one too. I'm not saying it can't be done or shouldn't be done, but we should be prepared to see very noticeable price increases on most consumer goods. And that's where the balancing act comes in. To what degree do you want independence, and to what degree do you want more affordable products? Ultimately, it's a balance between the two. The way you balance it is what fuels these political debates.
Yeah, we've got a couple of questions about China and Taiwan. How likely is it that the Chinese government will create an international crisis, for example, threaten to invade Taiwan, to deflect citizen concerns over economic and infrastructure quality of life issues?
Well, it's a really smart question. And there's no question that Taiwan has been much more bellicose in its language about Taiwan, and as we've all seen, in its military activity in the waters surrounding the island. How much of that is being done to distract the Chinese people from other domestic policy challenges, and how much of that is being done because the Chinese leadership does see their country as does establish such import in, as they would say, reuniting their country. It's probably some of both. I think even if there weren't domestic political crises or life crises in China to deal with, I suspect that you would see Xi and the people around him moving more aggressively against Taiwan now, just as they have against Hong Kong, just as they have against the Uyghurs, and just as they've done some saber rattling with Japan and South Korea, in Australia, and others in the region. I think that would be taking place regardless, because Xi has made it somewhat clear that he does see a much bigger and broader role for China on the world stage. But the questioner is smart to raise the point that they did, because in addition to those broader aspirations for his country, it is very savvy politics for the Chinese leadership to use nationalist language as they do to rally their people toward a foreign goal or foe, instead, and diverting their attention from domestic challenges. So I think that's some of the reason we're seeing it, but certainly not all.
Does Taiwan have the ability to resist an invasion by the People's Republic of China for more than a couple of days?
According to military analysts, the answer is no. That Taiwan, if left to their own devices, would not be able to defend themselves for any sustained period of time against a full-on attack from mainland China. And there's growing questions as to whether US military involvement in that region would be able to prevail against China. In simulated war games in recent years, there's been growing evidence that the US military, given its presence and capabilities in the Pacific Rim, might not be able to win that competition. So certainly without the direct US involvement, Taiwan would not be able to defend itself. With US involvement, it's more of an open question. But I think ultimately, if China continues to move in this direction, you would likely see not just the US, but a multilateral alliance beginning to stand up on Taiwan's behalf. And one of the things that Biden has been working very, very hard to do since taking office is to rebuild those alliances. This is a longer conversation for another day too, because not only does Biden have a challenge in convincing those countries that they can feel comfortable in re-engaging with the United States, but we're now seeing any number of countries, not just in the Pacific Rim, but in Europe, that see the benefits of a stronger, more positive relationship with China. And so the French leadership, for example, would be perfectly happy to set itself up as sort of a neutral arbiter between the two countries, rather than being part of a US-led alliance. The Biden administration is working as hard as it can, not just for Taiwan, but for any number of other security and economic and human rights goals, to convince other countries to become part of that alliance, knowing that they're much more likely to be able to stand up to China as part of a coalition like that one, rather than unilaterally.
Does the US have the moral standing to confront the Chinese on the Uyghurs, and does this create unnecessary tension with the Chinese?
Well, I think the US does have that standing. The Chinese think that thinks that the US does not. My own opinion is that regardless of the types of human rights abuses that we see in this country all too frequently, my own opinion is that they pale in comparison to the mass scale of atrocities that the Chinese government is inflicting against the Uyghurs. A spokesperson for the Chinese government would give you the exact opposite answer. Would say, don't tell us what to do in terms of protecting our own people against potential terrorism and criminal attack and other potential threats, while you have such unrest in your own country. So the fact that the US and China have such diametrically opposite views on that question of moral standing adds to those broader tensions that we were talking about earlier in the webinar.
Is there a risk of nuclear confrontation with China over Taiwan?
I don't know if there's a risk of nuclear confrontation. As we read recently, the chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff in the closing days of the Trump administration felt it necessary to inform his Chinese counterparts that then President Trump was not considering a nuclear attack on China. And I think that type of decision notwithstanding, I think the likelihood of the two countries ending up in a nuclear confrontation is relatively small, at least in the early stages, because of the way China has been circling Taiwan. It appears that they believe that they could win that type of a confrontation using conventional military resources as opposed to nuclear weapons. And it appears that the United States and its allies believe the same thing. Now, as we've learned over the course of the last 75 years, a conventional military attack can very quickly evolve into something much, much worse. And so you can never discount that when any type of conflict exists between two nuclear powers. But the question is, could that type of thing happen sort of by accident as the two countries were circling each other? I don't think it's probable. I think a conventional weapon escalation, while potentially tragic in its own right, is a much more probable occurrence than a nuclear encounter taking place until the conventional military confrontation had escalated to much, much greater levels.
This questioner has a question that kind of resolves our first topic and our second topic in an interesting way. Don't we need to follow the new Levi's slogan and buy less, wear longer, waste and throw away less? So in some ways, allowing the supply chain issue to actually kind of address the climate change issue in some ways. What are your thoughts?
I'm glad that someone linked the two topics together, because we did pick them for this week because of their overlap. So thank you to the questioner for that. So the Levi's slogan is great. I think it's a much more achievable slogan in a pre-COVID environment and possibly in a post-COVID environment than during the current environment. So I'll go back to what I was saying earlier. In the early stage, in 2019 and early 2020, more and more Americans were spending their disposable income on experiences, on restaurants, on movies, on trips, on sporting events, and less on things, less on material goods, which tends to dovetail with the point that the questioner was asking. Once we got shut down and we couldn't experience those things anymore, we couldn't go to restaurants, we couldn't go to movies or sporting events or take trips or vacations, we began spending our disposable income again on things, on goods, on products. And because more and more of us were ordering more and more of those products, the supply chain got more and more bogged down. So once COVID truly has passed and the world has returned to some type of normal, will our consumer habits revert to what they were pre-COVID, where we stress the experiences more than the goods? I don't know the answer to that, but the questioner makes a very good point, which is we're most likely to settle these kind of concerns if that shift back does take place. But I'm not enough of a sociologist to be able to make the kind of prediction. All I'm saying is it's a much harder goal to achieve now than it would have been 2 years ago.
Taiwan supplies much of the world's latest generation semiconductors. Would China risk an economic meltdown to further its unification ambitions?
Well, we don't know. And not only is Taiwan's semiconductor capacity relevant to China's decision, but if you think about how hard the United States has been working over the course of this year to rebuild its economic alliances in order to economically pressure China into improving its behavior, imagine how much more difficult China's international economic relationships would become if it took over Taiwan by force. So the semiconductor production on the island of Taiwan is one question to consider, but much more broadly, if China were to launch a full-on assault and occupation of Taiwan, the economic consequences for China would be much, much greater. And it doesn't mean they won't do it, but it's one of the considerations they have to weigh before deciding whether to move more aggressively or not just what the potential military cost might be, but there would be an immense economic cost to them, to the country.
I heard at a talk, and it was under Chatham House rules, so I can't say who it was, but they mentioned that if China were to invade Taiwan, the US's best recourse might be to destroy those places that make the silicon chips and those things so that China didn't have access to them. So I don't know if they're creating redundancies of those factories anywhere. I know the US can't really compete, but I thought that was an interesting and kind of scary prospect.
Well, it is interesting and it is important. I guess I'll just reiterate the previous point. The potential economic consequences to China are much, much greater than the semiconductor chip capacity. But I think you're right, Jessica, it's an interesting question. And whether those factories would be destroyed or disabled or co-opted, I don't have any way of knowing. But if China were making a decision on whether to invade Taiwan based primarily on economic considerations, it wouldn't do so. And it wouldn't do so for reasons having very little to do with semiconductors.
Interesting. Well, thank you again, Dan, and to our audience. I'm sorry we didn't get to all the questions, but there were a lot of great discussions in here. So thank you to our audience. We look forward to seeing you. I guess we have General McChrystal tomorrow and Fiona Hill on Friday, and then Dan will be back here next Tuesday. So thank you again. Kim, I'll turn this back over to you.
Jessica, thank you. As always, you handle those questions so deftly. Dan, I think you have done over 75 politics in the time of coronavirus since we started in March of 2020. You never cease to amaze me in terms of your breadth of coverage on these topics and how deftly you answer all these questions. So thank you so much.
Well, you're very kind, Kim, and I think you know, And I hope our group knows how much I enjoy these programs. And I hope that all of you do too.
Well, you keep us, well, as sane as we can possibly be in today's crazy news environment. Dan, stick with me while I just quickly go through a couple of our upcoming programs. Of course, everybody, Politics in the Time of Coronavirus every Tuesday at 5 p.m. And then we do, as Jessica said, have a conversation with Dr. Fiona Hill on the 15th with LA Times editor Doyle McManus. And tomorrow, Risk, a user's guide with General Stanley McChrystal. Coming up the following week, Social Media's Dark Side, a conversation with Roger McNamee. So please tune into that. We have Senator Todd Young on the 27th of October, and Peter Martin, Bloomberg's journalist who has a key specialty in China's security issues. So go to our website at lawacth.org and register today. Make a donation, become a member. We love you as part of our team. Thanks, everybody. See you tomorrow. Thanks, Dan.
Thanks so much, Kim. Thanks, everyone.